Chapter 6, Sources of International Marketing Data. Marketing without data is indeed like driving with your eyes closed, but the question is, where is the best place to find that data? Well, we'll look at several facets of data collection, including differentiating between primary and secondary, and finding the best sources. Let's look at primary versus secondary data. On the left, you see a couple trying out IKEA furniture. IKEA is facing an interesting challenge as many urban parts of the world offer smaller and smaller housing units and more users integrate technology into their homes. IKEA has the challenge of understanding what consumers want and need. So they've approached that research in an interesting fashion. There's three novel approaches that they're using currently. One is using virtual reality app in a headset so that users can explore one of three kitchen settings and experiment with changing the color of the counters and the drawers. Another approach that IKEA is using to understand a little bit better what consumers want is they're trying out using small, centrally located stores to collect orders that are placed online. This is very, very different from their usual big box format, but they wanted to see if that might work better for users. And third, this summer they released a report on how people live at home using a survey that they conducted on 12,000 people in 12 countries. And they had some very, very interesting findings from that. So my question to you is, looking at these three research approaches, do they describe primary or secondary research? And the answer is primary, because IKEA is conducting the research itself. Now, in contrast to that, last class, in addition to talking about IKEA, we spoke a bit about hair care products in Africa. And specifically, we looked at Henkel, a German company. And one of the data sources that hair care companies can tap is the report that you see on the right-hand side of your screen, produced by Euromonitor. Euromonitor puts out very, very good research, detailed research on hair care product sales throughout Africa. So if Henkel were wanting to get a preliminary feel for the demand in the market, they might utilize such a report, which would constitute secondary research. So primary research is research that the company itself conducts. Secondary research is looking at data that someone else has gathered for another reason. So let's look at some of the pros and cons of secondary data. The first is comparability. If you're looking at a report that says, well, family income in this country is X, family income in the other country is Y, the first question you should ask yourself is not, about the income, but about the family. What is a family? Granted, the family format is changing a bit in the United States, but stereotypically it's still thought of as parents and children. In many parts of the world, that's quite different. I think I'd mentioned before that in India, for instance, it's a mother, a father, their children, and the father's parents. That is part of the family unit. The father of the children never leaves his parents. He stays with them the rest of his life. Other countries, think about Nigeria. It's not a husband and wife, but potentially a husband and up to 4 wives. So some of the terms that we're used to using may not be comparable. So you need to make sure that your terms themselves are apples to apples. The second, of course, is lack of current data. And we saw this with some of the daytime classes. We're drilling down a bit further into the data last class using the CIA World Factbook. And one of the things that they found, I think one of the groups wanted to look at Iran, and they found that they just couldn't get the data that they wanted to the level of detail that they wanted. I had mentioned the country of Lesotho before. Good luck finding good data on that. Or even some of the other smaller countries that we've talked about throughout the class. It's very, very hard to get current data. You may get data that's 10 years old, in which case it's virtually meaningless. And then number 3, of course, is the cost of data. The Euromonitor report that I mentioned, for instance, is not cheap by any stretch. But then, of course, there equally or perhaps harder challenges with primary data. Usually it makes sense to start out with secondary data because on the whole it tends to be less expensive than conducting primary research. But sometimes, like in the IKEA case, you have to do your own research. So there you've got challenges with things like language. Are the terms that they're using comparable? How do some of them even translate? Infrastructure can be challenging in terms of conducting research. Things like sending out a survey. The survey that IKEA did in a very, very rural area in a poor country, it may be difficult just to get the mail to people if you are in fact mailing that survey. More likely, the survey person would have to go door to door if they're in a poorer country in a rural area. And then that brings up the topic of culture. Back to the example of Nigeria. If you've got a female researcher, she is less likely to be accepted in that role by Orthodox Muslims in Nigeria. By the same token, she's also likely to be found unacceptable by Orthodox Jews in Israel. So primary research can be very, very challenging, and those challenges have to be taken into account. Okay. Some thoughts on resolving data challenge. Your author goes into some issues that are worth rereading on segmenting the research and defining the budget, and dealing with data problems. Specifically, if you've got a product that has been sold before, let's say you're selling sports equipment, it may not be terribly difficult to find research on sports equipment or toys. The research is certainly there for most developed countries, or even developing for something for a common category. If you've got a new product, an example might be a CIRAC machine, which does crowns in the dentist office, so they don't have to send it out to another lab. Those are becoming more and more popular in the United States. Let's say you wanted to sell a CIRAC machine to a country in which they haven't been sold before. Well, there's not identical figures. You could look at other dental equipment to get a good proxy variable. You could look at, substitute. Look at the next closest thing. Okay. Last class, I suggested using kind of a funnel to narrow down which countries might be appropriate for your product. And I believe that I alluded to the CIA World Factbook as a good place to start, but I want to give you some other resources, primarily ones that your author also talks about. All right, your author gives you several resources for research. I would start with the CIA World Factbook, and I believe I've alluded to that website before. It's for the first part. Let me go back a little bit and look at the funnel. For the first part of the funnel, especially for demographics, for economic and financial, and a little bit of political legal, it's a really great starting point. I don't mean it as an end point in that to flesh out the research, you really need to look at some other sources, but it's a fantastic starting point. The World Bank also is a very, very good resource for economic data. It drills down a little bit further than the CIA World Factbook. So I had promised you in the syllabus that we would have 2 or 3 cases throughout the year, and the evening class has been asking for something substantive to sink their teeth into. So I thought this would be a really good jumping off point for that. So I'm putting together a case on comparing Norway and China as potential markets for Starbucks. So these are some of the resources you can use to conduct that research. And I won't make it due for another month or so not to worry about that. But now is a good time to start looking at some of these sources.